Hello, everybody. The topic of my talk is Art and History in Alciato's Emblemata. The image represents a construction whose foundations reside in the reality and the imaginative ability of the artist, who voluntarily and involuntarily conveys messages. By analyzing several editions of the Pictura of the Emblemata by Alciato, so widely distributed during the Renaissance, social, political, and financial and religious issues are raised around each creation. Hence my choice for the present research and presentation. This is fertile ground for creativity, finding its inspiration in ancient and modern sources, and which allies the inscriptio with the picture and with the subscriptio in a dialectic and intelligent connection, challenging the reader to find meanings of the enigma. Particularly in the fields of economic history, these kind of sources are being ignored. Given its symbolic topics, it has been more investigated in the fields of literature and politics. However, even though it has a greater representation in political thought, there are elements that are necessarily combined with the social, economic, and mental elements, thus allowing an interdisciplinary study that will deepen historic reality. Andrea Alciato, 1492 to 1550, was chosen as the first author to invest in this kind of work, the Book of Emblems, to be divulged in different places and at different times. He was a Milanese jurist, and his work was printed in continuous editions in Latin and vulgar languages, bringing with it the marks of different printers and the contribution of commentators. He studied in Milan and also in Pavia, Bologna, and Ferrara. He taught law in Italy and in France in diverse periods of his life, including Bourges from 1529 to 1534 by the invitation of Francis I. In this particular case, we chose the emblem Quod non capit Christus, capit fiscus, entirely composed by this maxim or inscription, that is to say, a sentence that summarizes the message. By the engraving or picture, that is an elusive symbolic scene, and by the commentary or subscription, namely a text in prose or a poem. Together with the emblem, Opulentia tyranni paupertas subjectorum, it is one of the few cases that allow us to develop the thoughts on economic and financial politics of the 16th century, that is, incomes and distribution of goods at the level of the sovereign powers, the connection of supreme power with statements of society, forms of control and the execution of justice. In the second emblem, the rapacity of the prince is purposely enhanced, whereas in the first emblem, which will be analyzed in greater depth, the covetousness of the subjects themselves is also reflected on, as well as the answer of a shrewd ruler who collects through his punishment material advantage, confiscating for his benefit assets wrongly acquired. Let us then take a closer look at some of the editions of this emblem, its alterations and comments in different contexts. Alciato's first editions are from Augsburg. Heinrich Steiner introduced the prints in the collection, distributed in Latin and afterwards in French, German, Italian, and Spanish, thus becoming known throughout the whole of Europe. He was also read and preserved in libraries belonging to great 16th century Portuguese noblemen, such as the Duke de Bragança or the Conde de Cantanhete. Here we have one of the editions from 1531, namely the one from 28 February, from the Emblematum Liber, whose prints are by Hans Schöfflein from the painter Jörg Bro, and whose engraving is found in the Augsburg edition of 1534. However, being altered in the French edition of the same year, already revised by Alciato in France. The maxim quod non capit Christus rapit fiscus, which could be translated as what Christ does not receive exchequer seizes, is followed by a print that displays a king with the traditional symbols of the crown and scepter, squeezing with his left hand a sponge that releases abundant liquid. The final enigma of this ensemble is found in the following comment. The prince twists with a firm hand the seeping sponge, which he previously sucked. He drives the thieves to the top and then pressurize them so that he may return to his own treasure the illicit gains got by those thieves. Where the comment not so explicit, the maxim itself and the print could make us think of Lutheran influences in Germany and of the words of Luther addressing the civil authorities to undertake the true reform that the church seemed incapable of pursuing. But in this case, we clearly face issues as such as the prince's or the king's sovereignty that controls social discipline, no longer as a referee, but as the supreme power, probably only restrained by what the church demands from Christian communities. A sovereign who strategically does not forget the incomes due to him, the channeling of taxes, the percentage of rents, etc. A supreme judge who, whenever fraud is committed and there is reason for severe punishment, that is to say, seizure of assets, levies to the crown the sums seized. In the following years, the edition continued in France and revised by Alciato himself, published in Paris by Christian Vechel, both in Latin and in French, translated by Jean Lefebvre, secretary of the Cardinal of Givry, or with adaptations and with prints probably devised by Mercule Jolat. Here we present a print that already appeared in 1534 and also in the 1536 edition in the Livret des Emblèmes. The main subject is still present, although the firm hand that squeezed the sponge is now the right hand. This print is more elaborate, especially in the background that surrounds the regal figure. The crowd gathers around the public showing of a beheading, and on the other side there is a hanging. Thus, all alleged spectators of the regal act are present, as well as the tortured ones, as are the instruments of such torture. This is an image with a greater pedagogical dimension, in fact, emphasizing the judicial consequences of criminal acts and the supremacy of the king in relation to courts. We think it's necessary to bear in mind the French origin of this new print and to stress the fact that Alciato himself was its proofreader, also widely appreciated by Francis I. The king of France was introducing in his favor important institutional changes. And exactly in 1534, the placards case occurred and an attack on the palace at the door of the king's chambers in Blois against the Catholic Mass, an event that Francis I took as a crime of lèse-majesté. As from then on, there was a wave of severe persecutions in several regions against persons and communities suspected of heresy, with public punishments, including extreme violence. Those who did not like the oath of allegiance to the king and his unique fate would be purged from administrative and judicial institutions. The new atmosphere involved the circles of evangelical humanism, the king's relatives and the court's entourage, and the intellectuals who ended up by being condemned or had to seek exile. On the other hand, the questions of heresy moved from the inquisitorial level to the parliamentary level, thus giving more sovereignty in these matters to the king. Without trivializing the contribution of investigations in the field of history of art, the studies by Fernando Pousa, Federico Palomo, and Ana Isabel Bues on several topics have led us to consider the efficacy of the records, not only printed, but also oral, iconic, and visual, as means of strategy and persuasion. All figurative language can move feelings and cause interpretations in the spectator, which is always a social interpretation. No wonder then that Alciato's work was also spread by French printers in Spanish translations, a fact that would considerably broaden its impact inclusively in Spanish and also in Portuguese domains. Besides translations, perhaps more literal from Latin were made. That is the case in 1549 of several editions printed in Lyon. The king is here looking more overbearing, coupled with symbols such as the column and the lion, besides the scepter, on top of a grand staircase in his palace. The far-off scene of these cushions is depicted in more detail. There is also a flock of birds, a sign of unity. This same print, attributed to Pierre Esric or Duvaz, appears in the Massé Bonhomme editions for Guillaume Rouy, as well as in Los Emblemas, Spanish translation by Bernardino Daça, future professor of law in Valladolid, as in the French translation without Latin by Barthélemy Arnault, an important humanist related to the Collège de la Trinité in Lyon. It is necessary to make greater reference to their individual comments. The first one stresses the king's avarice, calling him the covetous king, who lets the offender commit wrongdoings so that he can afterwards usurp the fertility, gain the treasuries. Thus, it is enhanced now in the Spanish translation, a tyranny of the ruler founded on stratagems in order to increase his income, moreover, at the expense of unscrupulous thieves. But the comments in French by Arnault are clear and more direct, being indeed the basis of scholarly editions from 1570. The Descriptio Aesthesis, the covetous prince who thinks ahead, letting his sponge completely absorb what he will later confiscate when punishing the thieves. But the following comments explicitly identify which social groups they refer to, the ones who plunder and the ones who are plundered. They were the finance authorities the kings appointed, thinking they were good and loyal men, and who, once fascinated by the riches that filtered through their hands, became thieves. So the ruler, letting them get as rich as they could, like a full sponge, punished them by confiscating their assets. The comment finishes with a very enlightening note. The seizures are on behalf of the state and not of those from whom they had been dispossessed. We are therefore faced with a criticism of the administrative management system of public assets. The misappropriation of assets is up to a point permitted. This fact reminds us of the study made by Vicens Vives on up to what extent corruption was part of the political system itself. On the other hand, it is also a criticism of the lack of fair redistribution of income to the subjects, perhaps even an elucidation on their right to rebel. Let us move on the last example from the ones we chose, a Latin edition also published in France, Lyon, in 1566, Emblematum Libri II, by Jean de Tourne and Guillaume Gazou, with prints by Bernard Salomon and comments by Sebastian Stockheimer, known as From Coimbra. There is also a dedication by him to Dom João de Menezes de Sotomayor. Naturally, the work by Alciato would have reached Portugal years earlier and in an easier way through the Latin and Castilian editions. Its presence is proven in the library of the Duque de Bragança. The commentaries of the book presently analyzed would have been made in the Coimbra humanist environment of about 1551 by Stockheimer, born in Ingolstadt and who arrived in Portugal in 1547 as secretary to Fábio Arcas and invited by Dom João III to be professor at Coimbra University. Stockheimer studied there. He became a knight of the royal household in 1554 and would hold the post of proofreader in the very same academy. He would have met the Count Cantanhede, hence his dedication to Dom João de Menezes de Sotomayor, whose enthusiasm for Alciato has been well established. I believe it of great significance to add this comment from 1556 to that of the Spanish translation from 1549. It is possible to verify the interpretation of the circuit of incomes at the time. The sovereign collects parts of the income through taxes and royalties, as well as from seizures in cases of severe crime. Let us recall that in Portugal, amongst the crimes that led to the confiscation of assets and the death penalty is the crime of lèse-majesté, the crime against the sovereign, who is the representative of God on earth, his relatives and images representing him, and the crime of heresy, the crime against God. Through confiscation, the stolen assets are returned to the royal treasury, but does this strategy of letting the thieves get rich, mainly if they are royal treasury authorities and officials, make the king both a richer entity and a more conscientious and positive authority in terms of public personage? The several comments that we have addressed enlighten us on political and economic management theories and controversies, given the existence of authors whose opinions viewed the king through his justice and his protection of his subjects as someone who should be loved more than feared. A king who consents death by official authorities acting under his orders does not seem to conscientiously follow Christian ethics. Erasmus said that the real crime of lèse-majesté was the one committed by the prince against his people. Only through documents from the courts and reports by individuals, including a vereador da Fazenda, do António da Taíde, Conde da Castanheira, who wrote to the sovereign on what he considered politically dangerous, which is a general attack on justice, do we understand the scale of the condemnations of the official authorities of the public treasury. They, according to Ataïde, would suddenly get rich and should therefore be subject to investigation and be punished. Even though there is a coincidence with the comments to Alciato from 1549, I nevertheless think that the Conde de Castanheira would not like the practice of controlling the treasury officials, a real plague in the eyes of the people, and their penalty should be made at such long intervals to the point of getting the sponge full. To conclude, the sponge could be squeezed at the rhythm and intensity an absolute monarch would wish. But we know, however, that his actions were always constrained by the subjects themselves, their privilege and service. Thank you.